All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and afternoon. I'm Victoria McColm. I'm the Managing Director at McColm and Company, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator today on this panel examining COVID-19's impact on violent extremism globally. We're delighted to host this esteemed panel of experts to explore the impacts, challenges, and opportunities that COVID-19 has presented to violent extremists. We're joined today by Dr. Nilofer Saki, who's the Director of Policy and Diplomacy at McColm and Company, Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, who is with the Wilson Center, and Dr. Olaf Kronvall with Georgetown University. We'll begin today with opening remarks from each of the panelists for about 5 minutes. Then we'll move into a moderated discussion. I'll ask each panelist to please introduce themselves and their work as they give their opening remarks. And let's begin with Dr. Saki.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everyone joining us from different parts of the world. As Victoria mentioned, my name is Nilofer Saki, and I am Director of Policy and Diplomacy at McColm and Company. We are focusing on peace building, peacemaking, and diplomatic relationships, regional efforts, and mostly around the peace building and peacemaking services that we provide. Well, here for the opening remarks, I was thinking actually to start with a little bit of highlights about what extremism and what violent extremism is, and how COVID-19 and pandemic overall played a role in this particular bigger context of extremism. Coming from an academic perspective, the literature highlights different concepts and definition of extremism and violent extremism. Overall, in the literature, it says that extremism is a process by which individuals and groups become extreme in their views or behavior, and sometimes or both. And violent extremism is a justified violence to further socio-economic and political objectives of particular groups. And often the act of violent extremism and extremism itself are performed by non-state actors and many contexts. Extremism and terrorism are also used interchangeably in different literature, but what I see that extremism is an act, and violent extremism is a process of facilitating those acts. So for me, I would see violent extremism as a process, as a longer term process, which requires, it's comprehensive of changing ideologies, it's comprehensive of developing tactics and tools to serve the purpose of non-state actors to achieve their economic, social, political gains. And this plays a major role actually now, where we see how COVID-19 can fit into this violent extremism a concept that I explained, which is inclusive, which is a long-term process of changing societies and changing ideologies and developing tactics for any extremist act, including terrorism. So therefore, for that, I also looked, by the way, last year when the COVID-19 was in surge, I looked at some data that how it impacted the socio-economic conditions of people, what were people's responses, how it added to the grievances. And I found a lot that I'm going to discuss in my future remarks as well. But for now, I just want to highlight how how COVID and pandemic has further fueled the drivers of radicalization and violent extremism. So there are many factors, there are many drivers of radicalization that we have seen across different communities, groups and contexts. The few of them, which are highlighted by reporters, researchers, and the literature, are for sure socioeconomic factors, which goes back to the deprivation of basic human needs, and where people don't have the sense of recognition, where people don't have equal opportunities, when people don't have the equal sense of identity and their particular society. That adds to socio-economic deprivation, and that adds to grievances, which becomes one of the major drivers of radicalization. The other factor that's highlighted in the reporting and research from different contexts is the bad governance. Bad governance and both local governance and national governance and global governance sometimes, that adds to radicalization and extremism internationally and globally. And then political instability of countries highlighted another factor, another driver of radicalization, marginalization of young people from society and from, especially from political participation and jobs opportunities, economic markets. And some literature I also looked at, which relies on empirical data, is ethnic and ideological rivalries. So they are the drivers. They're the driver of radicalization, and COVID and pandemic fueled these drivers in many contexts from last at least 1.5 years that we have been looking into this data. Why? Why COVID, and why that has added or fueled these drivers of armed conflict, or these drivers of violent extremism? There are a number of reasons. First, because many reports actually highlights. I was looking at the UNITAR report. I was looking at the reports by the NGOs from across the country, especially from Nigeria, from Sri Lanka, from Afghanistan, from Myanmar. I was looking at all these country-specific reports where it seems that the extremist groups, and especially the insurgents, non-actors, non-state actors, they are using this pandemic to delegitimize the governments of that particular context. And that added mostly and creating a context of mistrust among the population, where people are not trusting their leaders anymore, the government anymore. And on the other hand, of course, there's abuse of resources and lack of good governance that also added to that people's perception and people's mistrust. But overall, the insurgents, they use this opportunity to disrupt and further add to the delegitimization of systems and those contexts. That created more frustration among the communities, among the people, and they joined, in some contexts that I was looking at, especially in the remote areas, communities, this insurgent provided services, filled the gap of the governance, and they provided services. They act as a service provider, which they got trust of the communities, and people joined them. So that is one of the tool that insurgents use in order to create a context or a situation of mistrust in different communities. The other one is that most of these reports are highlighting is actually the use of the technology. The use of technology also is highlighted, one of the major tool for insurgents to spread and to use technology as a tool to attract more people to whatever format or alliance they had. I stop here. There are other factors and drivers that I'm going to talk in my future remarks, but for now I stop here, and then let's see how it goes for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Niloufar. Dr. Parameswaran.
Thanks, Victoria. And let me also thank my panelists, Niloufar and Olaf. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll keep my remarks brief. And let me first start by just associating myself with Niloufar's remarks, both about the definition that we should adopt with respect to extremism, and then also understanding it as sort of a process that occurs within broader political and socioeconomic dynamics, rather than something that's focused on a particular set of groups or a particular ideology. I think that's extremely important to keep in mind, because COVID-19, if anything, has reinforced that lesson for all of us, not just on a regional basis or country basis, but really globally as well. I would say, if I were to think about COVID-19's implications for how we understand extremism, if I were to sort of make a sort of brief one-sentence characterization, I would say it sort of exacerbated some of the complexities and the challenges with respect to extremism that Niloufar has highlighted. And I would say with respect to three categories. One is with respect to the extremist groups themselves. The second is with respect to governments. And the third is with respect to regional and global cooperation. On the extremist groups themselves, I think we already saw this pattern where, if we were to think about the paradigm shift that we saw after the September 11 attacks, a gradual shift from just a focus on Islamist groups and individual organizations to really a whole array of groups and actors, which is a much more sophisticated understanding that Niloufar sort of mentioned, looking at lone wolves, looking not just at Islamist groups, but also right-wing extremism in Western countries, North America, Europe, Oceania. And that's really where the global conversation has gotten us. It's a much more diversified landscape. And COVID-19 has exacerbated that within individual regions. So you look at South Asia, if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, these were primarily the two hotspots that we were talking about in the post-Islamic State climate and context, where you had a string of affiliate groups, lone wolves, and other actors. And I think that's really what we've seen. The Global Terrorist Index from last year that was done a little bit before the pandemic, admittedly, showed that 7 out of the 10 countries that recorded an increase in terrorism incidents, they were found in Sub-Saharan Africa. It also found that there was an extremely high increase in terms of right-wing extremism, not just in terms of offline activity, but as the pandemic has surged, a lot of online activity as well. So groups like QAnon in a Western context, but then also the use of Islamic State propaganda, including some of their publications, have actually piggybacked on COVID-19 as sort of this apocalyptic narrative that shows that the Islamic State is seeking to reshape the global landscape. So a lot of the conversation that's really interesting is how these Islamist groups have used COVID-19 to actually get around some of these social media mechanisms to actually avoid spaces where they can avoid detection. So that's, I think, with respect to the extremist groups where we're headed. With respect to governments, I think there's been a tendency to first sort of focus a little bit on pandemic competence, which I think is understandable. But with the focus of pandemic competence, we're also seeing some governments take their eye off the ball when it comes to the management of terrorism and extremism. And I think that's an extremely dangerous dynamic. I think a trend that we see repeatedly across the board is that when governments treat extremism as only something to eradicate when they see terrorist incidents, they miss the broader reality that Nilüfer highlighted, which is that extremism is a process that is partly embedded in socio-political and economic dynamics in these countries. And so when you don't have cross-national or transnational terrorist groups, that is actually an opportunity for you to make the inroads on addressing the root causes, rather than actually being conceited and sort of looking at other threats. Unfortunately, that is something that's quite concerning that we're seeing, particularly in some African countries in particular. We're seeing this a little bit in Rwanda, for example. We've seen this a little bit in Uganda, somewhat in South Africa, but we're also seeing this in Asia. Nilüfer mentioned Myanmar, for example, and the case of the Rohingya population. We're seeing actually a lot of hate directed at minority groups like the Rohingya that are taking place in Bangladesh. We're seeing a continuation of the unfortunate human rights violations that we're seeing with respect to the Uyghurs in China in the name of terrorism and extremism. So that's been a little bit unfortunate, because that is coexisting with democracy concerns that have already been there. So the Economics Intelligence Unit, they do their annual assessment. The score for their index, the last year that they took it, which is last year, 5.37 out of 10 is what they recorded, which is the lowest level since they started recording data in 2006. So this trend of authoritarianism is not something that is just in perception. The data just does bear that out as well. And then the last thing I'd say briefly is global cooperation. We've seen a lot of challenges on that front as well. It's important to keep in mind that a lot of the activities by global organizations that sometimes go underappreciated, the United Nations, for example, and its counterterrorism bodies, a lot of it involves country-based assessments that involve them going to the field and actually figuring out, are these countries actually complying and saying what they're doing? And they've not been able to carry out a lot of those assessments, and that slowed a lot of the work in the subcommittees, and a lot of their analyses and assessments have actually been held back. Virtual conversations can help alleviate that somewhat, but they can't obviously substitute for on the field, on the ground research and analysis. And it's a bit striking. So you look at documents such as the G7 communique that just came out a few days ago. Extremism is only mentioned once in that entire document, and it's got dozens and dozens of points. China is referenced, 3 or 4 times, and that's a country, not a nationwide and global priority. And even then, there was a lot of narrow focus on just the sort of online component rather than the the process-based conversation that we really need to talk about. So I think that's been a little bit unfortunate on the global cooperation side, but hopefully that will change. I am also concerned a little bit that, in contrast to the post-September 11 context where there was a little bit of an overreaction in some quarters with respect to terrorism and extremism, I think now we're seeing a little bit of underreaction and also a focus on major power and great power competition between the United States and China. That's extremely important. And I definitely don't want to suggest that we should take our eye off of that. I just hope that we're not just focusing on COVID-19 and US-China competition. I hope that climate, but also counterterrorism and extremism is important. And we should actually use the period where if there's a decline in overall terrorist activity, that is an opportunity for us to think even more about extremism, not less. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prashant. Dr. Kronvall.
Yes, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm primarily interested in violent extremism from the perspective of armed conflict, conflict termination, counterinsurgency, peace building, and so on. And of course, since many of the actors in today's armed conflicts are violent extremists, that extremist organizations, that is the angle that I've mostly looked at. And we can elaborate on the specifics of that later, but I have a few general remarks. First, sort of trying to take a step back here to frame some of the things we'll talk about later. And I also want to say that many of the things that Nilofar and Prashant have said, I would certainly agree with. One is, of course, that the pandemic is a transformational event on a global level, that it has economic, social, and political consequences of all kinds. And I think in some respects we can compare it to the world wars, for example, that transformed the whole international system. A related point is that I think it's important here to distinguish between short-term and long-term effects. And I think we'll probably mostly be talking about short-term effects today, trying to stop the bleeding or putting out fires or whatever analogy you want to use. But I would like us to keep that in mind, that we are looking at short-term and long-term effects here. And of course, also related to the first point, I would say that the long-term effects of cataclysmic events like this, shocks to the whole international system, are almost always very hard to accurately predict. So there's a large dose of uncertainty here, I would say, especially in the longer term. Also, even in the short term, I mean, yes, we are able to discern certain trends and events and developments. I mean, there is data that we can use, but I think also here it is important to sort of have a caveat that several of the research reports on these themes, they will point out that it has become harder for scholars, journalists, international monitors, peacekeepers, and so on to actually see and record and report what is going on in conflict areas, and in no small part that is because of COVID and restrictions and so on. So just as some background parameters here for the continued discussion. So again, we do see a few trends. Nilofar and Prashant have certainly laid out some of them. I would agree that what we mostly see is that COVID is exacerbating many of the existing tensions we have, in some cases accelerating some of these processes. Overall, we could expect, I think, both in the short and the long term, that the chaos and poverty and things like that we see as a result of COVID would provide violent extremists with opportunities. This is an almost constant historical trend, that these kinds of upheaval and turmoil, political and social economic, does provide the kind of environment in which violent and the other extremist movements can thrive. So that, I think, will probably be both a short-term and long-term issue that we will have to deal with. And then, of course, you see this also has impacts on sort of a very very tangible level, the nuts and bolts of peace processes. For example, there are examples of peace negotiations being not necessarily halted, but delayed because of COVID related issues. We have, for example, the talks on peace in Syria in Geneva, where they were delayed at least for some time because some of the delegates who were tested positive for COVID. And we also have the impact of social distancing, the reluctance for people to meet face to face. And then that, of course, poses a very practical logistical challenge to peace process. And we can talk more about that later. We were also asked to take a look at what policymakers should do. And I'm reluctant to give them hard and fast answers as to how they should deal with this whole complex of issues. So I'll just focus on a few general concerns or principles here as well. The first one, I think, is that there's probably no universal blueprint. This is how you tackle COVID and violent extremism and nexus. I think it's a very complex and vast issue. So we will have to deal with it, but we will have to do it carefully and avoid the temptation to find simple formulas. If you look at this in the context of peace processes and so on, we as always have to bear in mind that each conflict is unique, and we will have to bear that in mind. Again, I think, having said that, I think we do see some overarching trends, for example, that many extremists have tried to exploit, and sometimes perhaps successfully. They are trying to exploit this. For example, like Nilofar mentioned, trying to delegitimize the governments against who they're fighting. So we can certainly see some trends here. And I think, again, in terms of policy, if we keep it on a very sort of broad level here to start with, I think the single most important thing that Western governments and the US government could do would be, and this may seem obvious, it would be to try to get the pandemic under control. Because to the extent that it fuels radicalization, to the extent that it provides extremists with opportunities and so on, then it follows logically that if you can curb or ideally get this pandemic under control, then you will also remove that advantage to violent extremist groups. Now, this is of course easier said than done. There are all kinds of issues here, some of them very practical. How do you assist in vaccine distribution, for example, in a country where the government is very weak or fragile, and where you would need to move, where you would have to reach rural areas and so on. So yeah, this of course there are a number of related issues here as well. And I think I'll stop there, and we can elaborate on some of these themes during the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Olaf. So I'd like to start the discussion. Each of you are experts in violent extremism, peace building, conflict analysis, and so on, but you also each have a geographical area of expertise generally. So I'd like to kick off with a question to the group. I'd like for each of you to answer about how has COVID-19 affected extremism globally, and are there differences across the regions? And then follow on to that, are there differences that you're seeing in how it's impacting fragile states versus conflict affected states versus states that are generally historically stable? And I'd like to start with Prashant.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. It's an interesting and kind of a tough question, because I think we're seeing the geographic distinction also play out cross-cutting with other differences as well, including development levels, and then also the individual case issues and distinctions within the countries, including urban-rural divides, like Olaf was mentioning. And I think that's important. I would say two things in general, though. One is there's a bit of an interaction with respect to regional variation and development levels. So, for example, you're seeing this trend that I mentioned earlier of, a variety of different strains across the world that are being exacerbated. So you're seeing, Islamic extremism in the post ISIS context in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and then parts of Southeast Asia and parts of the Middle East. And then you're also seeing right-wing extremism and that conversation happen in the United States, Europe, and Oceania as well. And I think those conversations, to my mind, should be a little bit more integrated in terms of an overall conversation, because we get a lot of cross-cutting there in terms of, the undercurrents of extremism, but then also lone wolves and sort of subgroupings that are not really extremist groups per se, but loose groupings that are online that are sympathizers in that regard. And I think that cross-fertilization, my sense is that it hasn't happened as much as we would initially have thought. And then the second thing I would mention is keeping our eye on cross-regional focus areas. So, in the region I work on the most, which is the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia in particular has been seen, in the context of the post 9/11 period as being sort of the second front in the global war on terrorism. That was the label. And I think to the extent that some of these countries may have taken their eye off the ball in terms of that as a major threat, I think, we have to be a little bit cautious about that. We're seeing a lot of trends play out still. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, and the last time we saw major changes like this in terms of military presence, there were reverberations across not just the Middle East, but other sub-regions as well. So I think that's the other thing I would keep an eye on, that sort of cross-regional conversation as well.
Great, thank you. Nilofar, your thoughts on South and Central Asia? I believe you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. I was looking at data about the peacemaking processes and how COVID has impacted those in the region, especially in the country I was looking at, Afghanistan, and then I was comparing with other like Yemen, Darfur, and I found that overall, as Olaf mentioned, the peace processes that was undergoing in those countries, that has been impacted seriously by the COVID. For example, the ceasefire has been negotiated in some places like Yemen, Darfur, and then reduction of violence was negotiated in Afghanistan. But they actually, the measure didn't have any substantial outcome. I would relate to the COVID-19 because the overall COVID and pandemic has slowed down the meetings, face-to-face meetings, first initially during early 2020, and the processes were on halt for some time. And then yes, the meeting started afterward overall, but that didn't go anywhere because of the state-to-state relationship didn't happen. The negotiation tables were not really organized well. So that is one of the similarities, not really the differences that I have seen in terms of peacemaking, the impact of COVID on the peacemaking processes that happen in this country. So that's one of the similarities. The differences that I have seen is, which I was kind of comparing Afghanistan most to the other country, is that the political instability that has given a lot of opportunities, provide a lot of opportunities for insurgents to use COVID and their own benefits. And for example, in Afghanistan, there was political instability and the lack of equal distribution of services, the misuse of COVID money and funds by the government agencies. And there are many other factors that the insurgents, especially the groups like the Taliban, who are at the negotiation table, they use that in order to, again, delegitimize the government, gain more support from the communities, expand their outreach, and that I have seen. And then I compare that with Nigeria, another country, not in the region, but a little bit beyond that, is in Nigeria, where that level of political instability was not there, then I have seen that there was evidence of anti-Islam sentiments that emerged. But in Afghanistan, there was no emergence of anti-Islam sentiments, there were anti-government sentiments. In Nigeria, there was evidence of anti-Islam sentiments. Why? Because mosques were closed, and people were not able to gather in the mosque, and that was used as a narrative that the government has a policy of disrupting religious and spiritual events, and that is they use that, actually the insurgents use that as a major point in order to benefit their movement. So the differences, as Prashant and Olaf mentioned, there are distinction, and the distinctions are really based on the context of if the political instability is there, what it means for COVID. If there's a social instability, what it means for COVID. If the level of grievances are high, what it means for COVID. So the different factors add more fuel to pandemic, and it's very contextual, as colleagues here mentioned, very contextual, and we have seen the variants are different, the trends are different and different contexts based on the level of the insurgency that is in those particular part of the world.
Thank you. Olaf.
So yeah, first the global picture. I've looked at a couple of comparative studies that analyze the effects on conflict intensity in different parts of the world. And one of them found that the global level of violence had not really been affected by COVID, but there were certainly regional differences. They primarily found that violence went down in Southeast Asia and the Caucasus, at least temporarily, while it actually increased in the Middle East. And the authors of this article didn't really have an answer as to why, but they pointed out that, you know, if we can sort of if we can identify some of the dynamics, why does violence go up in some places and down in others, that could also help us as a policy tool when we try to understand and perhaps mitigate these conflicts. And another study also found that in studying 9 countries, in 4 of them the level of violence declined, and in 5 it increased. And a similar question here: why does this happen, and why does it, you know, exacerbate conflict in some and reduce it in some places? So this is you know, some of the bigger picture. I'll say a few words about Ukraine and Western Europe. Ukraine was one of these places where some people hoped that, you know, COVID would eclipse the conflict and perhaps push the parties towards some sort of resolution, and we haven't really seen that happening. So that, I think, also illustrates that, yeah, this is one illustration of the principle that there are cases where COVID doesn't fundamentally impact the sort of more fundamental drivers of the conflict. It's had some technical impacts, like, for example, the fact that the negotiations have been done virtually rather than in person, for example, but no real shift in terms of coming closer to a solution or anything like that. Another point about Ukraine, which also goes to the wider issue that we've referred to several times here, the phenomenon where, you know, violent extremists take on, you know, they fill a gap where governments are doing poorly with combating COVID. They can step in and they can show that, you know, we are a better provider of services, and like we've talked about, delegitimize governments. Here we can see, we can think of this as perhaps the other side of the coin, because, you know, many of these violent extremists have the aspiration to act as states or as de facto states, and in some cases they have, of course, been successful. And in Ukraine, I would say then that the leadership of the so-called People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk would qualify as violent extremists, and they have, of course, run de facto states now for a number of years. But in that case, COVID hasn't necessarily benefited these movements. They are struggling, like many governments, with how to effectively deal with COVID. So I think it shows that, it's not necessarily a universal pattern, that violent extremists can capitalize on this and, show that governments are weak. When they are acting as de facto governments or de facto states themselves, they are posed with the same challenges than if you will, a more regular government would. So I think that's important to remember here as well. Ukraine, I'm not sure Ukraine would qualify as a fragile state, but it's certainly a state that is still struggling on some basic issues like rule of law and of course stabilizing its economy and so on. But we haven't seen a Ukrainian collapse due to COVID or anything like that, and Ukraine is also still able to, Ukraine has not been pushed to capitulate to Russia or to the so-called People's Republic. So Ukraine is at least sturdy enough to withstand COVID and still, not have to back down in this conflict. A few words about Western Europe as well, and especially Prashant has talked about that, the far right or the right-wing extremism and so on. And here, of course, we do see certainly how those groups are trying to use COVID for further radicalizing its supporters and to recruit new members as well. And that gives me an opportunity to comment on one of Prashant's points from his introduction, the relationship here between great power competition versus countering violent extremism. I think and I do agree that governments should ideally do both things at the same time, but I think that to some extent, at least, there is a convergence, meaning that things that you do for one of these purposes also helps with another, and Western Europe would, I think, partially illustrate this. And I'm thinking of the relatively strong link between some of these right-wing extremist movements and Russia. That would, of course, indicate that, if you are able to combat what these groups are doing, then you are also weakening Russian influence in Western Europe. And I think globally as well, some of the things that you would do in order to assist governments that are fighting an insurgency, some of the things you could do to help them in terms of trying to fight COVID in order for them to maintain political control and some level of legitimacy, some of those things would probably also be helpful in, for example, countering Chinese influence, Chinese vaccine diplomacy and soft power and so on. So I think that, yes, we do have to think of countering violent extremism and great power competition. They are certainly separate and distinctive fields, and they each have their own dynamic. But I think we can also think about how there can be synergy effects. Things that you do in order to counter China and or Russia may also help you counter violent extremism and vice versa.
Thank you. I'd like to move into a deeper discussion. Each of you have touched on the root causes question of extremism and violent extremism. How has COVID-19 affected recruitment and legitimacy of these groups in terms of being able to exploit root causes? Let's start with Nilüfer. I believe you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that. Thank you, Victoria. I was looking actually at the UNITAR report. I found it interesting. Based on some data that they collected, it says that there are positive impact of COVID-19 also, which I was actually looking at whether if there were positive impact or not. So they said that one of the positive impacts that they highlighted, that it decreased recruitment activities in public spheres and offline settings. Certainly, because of obvious reason, there was not more of this social gathering, there was distractions in public gathering, and that decreased overall the recruitment activities. With that said, though there's no data, but it is expected that there will be a significant increase in the recruitment to online activities, and especially through social media. So that is, again, there's no data to prove and provide an evidence, but there is an expectation that might produce more. As we have discussed earlier, that there are immediate impact of COVID and there are medium impact and long-term impact of COVID on the extremism overall. So I would imagine that should come up. And I think what I would see that as we in the policy and academic area, we built our capacities, online capacities. I think the insurgents have been doing the same. They have been actually building their capacities in a virtual settings, in an online settings. And COVID provided opportunities for them to have an alternative way of recruitment. And that is an online version, which they were not fully equipped with that before COVID. And COVID made them use and utilize resources in order to have more accessibility to media and learn the media, learn the technology, and use it for the recruitment. So I think that is going to come up. That is going to come up, and that will be a long-term impact of COVID on extremism. And social media will play a very major role. And if you see the trend in social media, we have seen that this insurgent group have become actually active in social media. Their messaging have changed. They are recruiting. They are having media staff now. They're having spokespeople who they work with, and they have become more articulate in their messaging, which could certainly help them in recruitment of more people in their area. So that is both a positive impact in a sense that it decreased recruitment in the public spheres, but negative impact that the COVID provided opportunity for insurgents to look at the alternative ways of recruitment, and that is social media. In today's world, social media plays an important role internationally and gather more and more support and create more motivation among the youth. And youth will be impacted more because youth are the beneficiaries and they're utilizing in large number the technology. So I think that will be the area, concerning area for the policymakers and overall for the counter-terrorism or counter-insurgency programming in future.
Thank you. Kind of following on with the tech and the media piece, we've seen that authoritarian governments around the world have taken liberties with the pandemic to close the societies further, and we've seen politicized disinformation in many Western countries. How are these dynamics impacting extremism from the COVID-19 perspective? Prashant.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of trends that I think we've seen so far, although it is important to keep in mind as well. I think, I'm not sure if it was Nilüfer or Olaf who made this point earlier, but I think it's an important one to keep in mind, which is the key thing with respect to the pandemic is competence, right? Rather than regime type. So it has reinforced, whether we're talking about democracies or more authoritarian governments, it really has put the focus on government's abilities to provide public goods and actually deal with the pandemic. That said, I think the data does bear this out. I mean, the authoritarian trend that we're seeing and the concerns about democracy, that's borne out by the Economist Intelligence Unit data that we've seen. The other two things I would say with respect to authoritarian governments and closer societies is, one, I think there is this sort of illusion that this gives the governments opportunities to crack down with harsher measures, which they can do in the context of the pandemic. So, and this is not just restricted to China, for example. So Indonesia, for example, we've seen the use of regulations and laws in the name of COVID to actually crack down on Islamist sympathizers and hardline activists, because the government finds that an easier justification to go after them. So the issue is that in that case, irrespective of how effective that is, it actually weakens public confidence in the rule of law and trust in governance. So that is a concern that we're seeing not just in authoritarian governments, but also in democratic settings as well. And then the final one I'll note is the online conversation. So one of the things we've seen in the pandemic, and the UN has noted this in the report, as Nilüfer mentioned, right? So the shift from offline to online, particularly with respect to social media, governments have focused, particularly authoritarian governments who have been policing a lot of online activity, have used that as a way to reinforce and strengthen measures in the name of cracking down on extremism and terrorism. So the problem with that is when you take such a narrow focus on trying to restrict individual freedoms, a lot of these terrorist groups and extremist groups are very good at just changing platforms, right? So the focus should not necessarily be on just deplatforming or restricting activity. It ultimately goes back down to what we've all been talking about, which is really focusing on the root causes individually. A good example in this regard is Myanmar, where I think we were getting and beginning to get to a conversation where we wanted to sort of talk a little bit more about hate speech with respect to the Rohingya, and a conversation among not just governments but social media companies, frankly, about how to police that activity. Unfortunately, the coup that we've seen in Myanmar has basically taken that conversation totally away from that issue to an issue of just governance of the country more generally. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. The pandemic has put a focus on some aspects of extremism and terrorism, but in other contexts, it also has really focused the minds of these countries on very basic issues such as poverty and vaccine access, and that perhaps has shifted the attention away from these issues that we were beginning to talk about before the pandemic.
Thank you. Olaf, what do you see as the new challenges and opportunities that COVID-19 presents to peacefully resolving extremism?
So yeah, we can perhaps start with the more positive side then. Like I said, it doesn't seem like there is a clear uniform effect of COVID on peace and war and armed conflict. I mean, the negative side then is that the hopes for a global decrease in armed conflict and sort of parties being pushed toward peace negotiations or resolutions, that has not really materialized. But there are some, well, we should note that some of the, on the other hand, some of these negotiations are continuing. We don't necessarily see a uniform trend of peace process being halted altogether. And there are also some local successes. I've seen that there is some work that's been sponsored by USIP, which is very locally centered in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and the Tal Afar province in Iraq. And there have been some successes there. A lot of it has to do with them assisting and working with local NGOs and networks, and with local government as well. And there seem to be some successes there. So one thing here would be to try to look very closely at those cases and see to what extent that those conditions and those mechanisms can be replicated elsewhere. Other than that, one trend that we have is that we haven't fully seen this have, I think, a decisive impact on any conflicts yet in terms of outcomes or so on. But one thing to keep our eyes on, I think, would be state actors as sponsors of parties in a civil war. Some people who follow the conflict in Yemen closely, for example, have noticed that Saudi Arabia, that is certainly struggling domestically with COVID, may be in a process of re-evaluating their role in that conflict, and perhaps ultimately that might change the dynamics of the conflict. And of course, you have Iran sponsoring parties in various local conflicts as well, also being hard hit by COVID, and perhaps being in a position to scale down or eventually withdraw that support. So again, I'm not aware of a case where we've seen this decide the outcome of a conflict, but it's certainly something to keep our eyes on. In terms of what the international community and Western governments can do, I mean, one sort of general thing to keep in mind here is that Western governments, including the US government, will be operating with new constraints. I mean, one thing we've already seen in 2020 is that contributions to UN peacekeeping operations has gone down, and it can, at least in part, be attributed to COVID in several ways. Part of it, of course, having to do with where the political focus and attention is, and also, of course, the economic costs for dealing with COVID and so on. So I think that this will have to be done with greater economic and political constraints than before. And then, of course, you have, I think I touched on this before, you have some of the inherent problems that come with any support for a peace process or support for a government that's challenged by a terrorist or insurgent movement. The struggle for legitimacy, that basic issue has not gone away, but as we've discussed here, it has more, we can say that in many cases it has transformed because of COVID, with violent extremist movements challenging or finding another forum for challenging governments. So that is certainly something to keep in mind as well.
Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end of our hour, so we'll go ahead and move into our final discussion. We'd like that to be focused on solutions and potential policy actions. So my question to the group is, what do policymakers need to do next to mitigate the pandemic's impacts on violent extremism? We've talked a lot about root causes, limited resources, focus is disrupted across the globe. So I'd like to hear from the panelists what your policy solutions might be or recommendations. And let's start with Nilüfer.
Thank you, Victoria. Well, as a student of conflict resolution and peace, I would see this as a conflict, and if it's not tackled well, it will create a protracted conflict in societies that will lead into armed conflict eventually. So that is why my policy recommendation will be multi-track approaches to peace. And what I mean by that is that the policymakers, I think it makes a lot of sense for policymakers to tackle these issues both from bottom top and top level. And since the causes are, we discussed the causes, that there's a top level issues like the government issues, good governance or bad governance. These are the issues that are part of this, the causes. And on the other hand, there are community-based issues that are generated or caused by the COVID. So therefore, the approach should be multi-track bottom top and top level. For the top level, I think building administrative and substantive capacity of administrative organization is important at this time. Strengthening official responses to counter disinformation and spread of false information based on the information that we have about the causes. That makes sense. And very practical ways and direct ways to move forward on a country-specific solution. And then also creating self-sufficient training capacities within local security forces. That is, I think, another policy act that policymakers can do. So overall, training the security forces and building the capacity of local government institutions to counter disinformation and also this spread of this substantive capacity. That's the top level. The bottom approach is the bottom-up approach is based on report. We have seen that in a number of countries, like in where was that, in Sri Lanka, Rwanda, Nigeria, Uganda, and based on the data and reports we have from these countries, it reduced the COVID reduced community policing, and the gap or the vacuum is filled by the non-state actors. So I think, again, focus on community policing, that makes a lot of sense in those countries. And based on, again, certain other reports, we have seen that it has disrupted social cohesion, and the COVID itself overall in many contexts. So, and social cohesion, building resiliency among communities, that happened with the investment of lots and lots of international community funding. And that has been disrupted, that has reduced with the COVID. So I think there should be more training packages for the communities, for NGOs, and also the training, the online training version should be introduced by the international organization community of funders in order to make people from remote areas to have access to those training. So that should be launched and introduced also in order to respond to this issue of resilience building, lack of resilience building, or social cohesion that has been disrupted by the COVID. So this overall, my take would be the top level and bottom top approaches through more training, more online training, introducing more online training to the remote areas of the communities and people who didn't have access and who don't have access to. And meanwhile, working with religious actors. In many contexts that we have seen that these religious actors played a very important role during COVID in order to, create anti-government sentiments, anti-system sentiments, or even to disrupt the status quo. So I think working with them also in this particular time makes a lot of sense in order to normalize the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilüfer. Olaf, your thoughts on policy solutions?
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. I see it's 10:57. So first, try to get the pandemic under control and help weak and fragile states doing the same to the extent that that's possible. Remember that some dynamics are still relevant. COVID has changed a lot, but not everything. For example, the central importance of legitimacy for incumbent government, and also the need to secure buy-in from local parties whenever you're talking about a peace process. Also, of course, governments will have to take economic and political constraints into account when they try to craft policies here. But also remember that there are some things that can be done that don't necessarily have to be very costly. For example, moving wholly or in part moving training of local security forces online rather than being in person. And then there could be other examples too of relatively low cost things that can be done. And finally, trying to circle back to one of the things I said at the beginning here, plan for handling the long-term effects. We don't know exactly what those will be. Some things I think we can be fairly certain of. The broad trend of COVID causing global social, political, economic upheaval, which then is likely to continue to fuel violent extremist movements, that in one form or another, I think we will have to be prepared for dealing with that. So I would recommend not to lose sight of that as we are dealing with the more immediate problems.
Thank you, Olaf. Prashant, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I would say, reinforce a lot of the points that both Nilüfer and Olaf mentioned. I would say 2 or 3 areas. One, the online component is going to be very important. I think that's probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of multilateral and global cooperation. So I mentioned earlier that G7 communique that was released, and I mentioned it didn't mention a lot about extremism and terrorism, but there was a reference in there about online safety. Other groupings like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue on a more global basis have also talked about the idea of emerging technologies as being a key frontier for global cooperation, and particularly a focus on addressing vulnerable populations, women and children, and online safety practices with respect to that. The other one I would flag is Nilüfer mentioned local communities and building social capital and social trust. I think that's going to be extremely important, lest this be sort of a government or national conversation that removes a lot of the communal measures that are required. So anything that's required, and I realize that, I think Olaf mentioned this earlier, funding and budgeting is a huge issue across the UN system. And you can see it in the data coming in from partners on extremism. But there are also very creative ways to leverage that. So Olaf mentioned sort of the connection between great power competition and extremism. There's also connections there between extremism and community building, and also, really frankly, the psychological consequences of isolation, loneliness, that I think it's going to lag a lot of the quantitative metrics that we're using to measure this. So the better we're able to sort of incorporate those metrics into ongoing programming, to take a wide approach to how we're managing this on a country basis, that'll be very important, particularly with countries that are struggling in the pandemic. And I mentioned, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in particular, but also, other regions in the Middle East and Southeast Asia.
Thank you so much to our panelists. This will conclude our session for today. We really appreciate you spending your time with us and sharing your insights on the variety and complexity of impacts of COVID on violent extremism. Thank you to our audience for taking your time to join us today. This session was recorded. It'll be live on our website for viewing later this week if there's interest. Thank you again.